We got breaking news here at the Heat Report because Miami signed Nassir Little to a one-year deal. Now, this should not be coming as a complete surprise to you because we did do a video on the channel last week about how the Heat worked out Little amongst other teams like the Boston Celtics, the Golden State Warriors, and Sacramento Kings. But Miami adds a player to their roster going into training camp that begins in a week. You're allowed to bring in 21 players at camp. The Heat currently had 19. Now they have 20. And Little will be in Boca Raton and in the Bahamas working out with the Miami Heat in the training camp portion. We'll break this all down, but hit that like button to welcome Nassir Little to a Miami Heat uniform. Hopefully Little is able to provide something for Miami. And Little is an intriguing player. He's a 3, he's a 4, he's athletic, he's a good defender. But I do expect this to be an Exhibit 10 contract because we've talked about this quite a bit. Well, the Heat don't have money to give. And they have an active roster spot available, right? They do. They only have 14. He would make 15 if it was a standard contract. But it would also put them into the second apron. And that's kind of what Greg Sylvander of 5 Reasons Sports Network also said here, saying Little contract is either going to be a training camp invite or they're going into the second apron with hopes of getting it under later. I'm going to guess it's going to be a training camp invite, just like Greg believes, because if they go over the second apron with hopes of getting under later, that means they were going to shed salary going in a different direction, which means they'd likely cut ties with a different player on the roster, and I don't really see that being the case unless they have a trade already in the works, but we're going to focus on Nassir Little in this video. So I expect this to be an Exhibit 10 contract and a training camp invite to see how Little plays, see how he performs in the preseason, in the training camp with these guys. And Little's intriguing because this is a former first-round pick. He was drafted 25th overall in the 2019 NBA draft from the Portland Trail Blazers, played his college ball at North Carolina, and he was one of the highly touted recruits coming out of that high school class. He was the second overall recruit going into the 2019 NBA draft. I believe he was just right behind Zion Williamson. And we talked about that in the video last week, that Nassir Little was actually deemed the Zion stopper due to his 6'5", 6'6" frame, 220 pounds, his athletic profile. He's got a real good plus wingspan, and he actually won, I believe, McDonald's All-American All-Star MVP and was like I said, he was a crazy high recruit coming out of high school, but it just really never materialized, and he was never able to really develop an offensive game, and that's always been something holding him back. In his career, he's played in 237 games. He's only averaged 5.5 points per game and 2.9 rebounds, and the three-point shot is what has really held him back. He's only shot 33% in his career. It's intriguing to see him go into free agency and ultimately be a potential training camp invite for the Miami Heat, because this is someone who was on the Phoenix Suns roster and got waived a month ago because they feel good about their 2 draft picks in this past draft, specifically Oso Ighodaro in the second round out of Marquette. He's an intriguing player that kind of took his spot, if we're going to be completely honest, in that roster. But I think Nassir Little is someone who could still impact winning at a small basis. Now, is he going to be a top 8 guy on a rotation? No, but he can be a top 12, top 13 guy due to his defensive prowess. It's just why I think Miami is willing to take a flyer on Nassir Little and bring him into their training camp and bring him into their organization. And if they believe they can get some more offense out of him, this is someone that could be maybe someone in the G League or someone who is getting called up and gets to play with the big dogs a couple times. It's a very intriguing situation. More to break down here on the video, but make sure you hit that sub button. We're going to break down all Miami Heat news. And listen, media days in a week, we'll break that all down as quotes come in and how Jimmy Butler arrives to Miami. And then we'll have training camp covered as well, as they are going to be in the Bahamas. And we'll be live for preseason games and when the regular season begins in a month at home against the Orlando Magic as well. All right, but as long as we continue the conversation here with Nassir Little, like his best career year came in 21-22 in 42 games for the Portland Trail Blazers, where he averaged 9.8 points per game, 5.6 rebounds. And the key there was it was one of his most efficient seasons in terms of scoring the basketball, shooting 46% from the field and 33% from 3. This past year was the first time he was outside of Portland. He spent the first 4 seasons of his career as a Trailblazer, and then last season with the Phoenix Suns, started 2 games, played in 45 and didn't really do much. But this is someone that is defensive minded. That is where he makes his bread and butter of being an NBA player. It's because he's got good athleticism, good physicality. And he actually, I wouldn't say reminds me of PJ Tucker, because Tucker is a way more established offensive scorer and a three-point shot that Nassir Little just simply doesn't have. And I think he's actually more closely related to a poor man's Haywood Highsmith, if that's respectable to say. Like, Highsmith this past year averaged 6.1 points per game, but he shot 39% from three. And that's the difference here. Little is going to be very similar to Highsmith in terms of their offensive deficiencies. Like, they're not going to give him the ball. You're never going to trust him handling the rock. But the difference between Highsmith and Nassir Little is that, well, Highsmith can catch and shoot and make a three-point shot. Nassir Little simply can't do that. But they are almost very similar in terms of their defensive ability. Highsmith is better defensively. I think Highsmith's one of the most underrated players in the NBA on the defensive side of the floor, not just on the Miami Heat. And I'll say this too. I think Double H is arguably the second best defender on this team, and I would say he is the second best defender behind Bam Adebayo, and your best point of attack, best wing guy right now. But we're talking about Nassir Little, not Haywood Highsmith here. But that's the type of stuff that he can bring to the table, and I'm fascinated to see how he's able to perform in preseason, in training camp with some of these guys on the Heat roster already, because he is going to be someone who does a hard work, and he does the little things correctly, which is what I like. And when I'm looking at Heat Twitter and seeing everything here, like, everybody's agreeing with me. Defensive-minded guy, fits the Miami Heat mold, physical tools that can elevate if he develops offensively a little bit. Brady Hawk's joking, says he'll be starting for a week in December. Now, I don't know how that's going to be the case, because like I said, there is a chance that this is a standard contract, but I would probably lean against that due to the financial implications of him pushing him over the second apron. But an underrated part of this, a lot of us, hand up here, wanted Isaiah Stevens, the UDFA point guard out of Colorado State, to be the final two-way contract for Miami. Well, maybe it's actually going to be Nassir Little here, folks, because Kashad Johnson's on a two-way deal, deserves it. Josh Christopher's on a two-way deal, deserves it. And the last two-way deal right now is Dru Smith. And all of us expect that Dru Smith is not going to have a two-way contract by the end of training camp. I think they just did him a solid, let him rehab, collect some checks over the offseason. But when it comes down to it, he should not be on a two-way contract. And Little could be the person that fills that. We all thought it was going to go to a Zion Pullen, who got his two-way took in favor of Josh Christopher, but is still getting an Exhibit 10 training camp invite for Miami, or the Isaiah Stevens. But maybe bringing Nassir Little on Exhibit 10, he's going to be in training camp, he'll be in the preseason, he'll be working out, and maybe Little ultimately grabs that second or that final two-way contract, I should say. And now you'll have two versatile defensive 3-and-D wings in Kashad Johnson and Nassir Little. Now, the three isn't too strong, but the defense is there for both Little and Kashad Johnson. And it could be a player that, if Miami suffers injury throughout the season, could be easily brought in during a stretch of a couple games if there's an injury to Jimmy or Jaime or Haywood Highsmith. And Nassir Little ultimately is able to be on that roster for a week or two and be able to have the same type of role as a Haywood Highsmith, like I said. I think this is something that we'll have to monitor. I am going to have to assume off first glance that this is going to be an Exhibit 10 contract and a training camp invite to allow him to potentially get that final two-way contract from Dru Smith. And that is how I view this signing personally. But let me know your one-word reaction to Nassir Little being signed by the Miami Heat. I don't even know what my one word is. That's why I want to hear yours. That is just how I feel about it. And I guess if I had to give my one word, I'd say two-way, because that's how I think he can ultimately make this roster. Now, I'm seeing a couple people out there say could be non-guaranteed until he makes the final roster, which is basically just a flyer on the guy to bring him into training camp and into the preseason. I don't see that likely. That's just how I feel. I think the most likely scenario here is that he ultimately just got a training camp invite, bring him in, see what happens, and then if he ultimately shows something worth developing or keeping around in the 305, they can give him the final two-way contract over Dru Smith, keep him in the G League, play up in the big leagues if they need him to, and that's kind of how I see the situation with Nassir Little. But shout out to Nassir Little for joining the Miami Heat organization. Hopefully everything goes well for him and the Heat get everything they want out of him. Former first-round pick, 25th overall. Shout out Nassir Little. We'll see you tomorrow with another video. Go Heat.